title for tonight's talk really reflects on a couple of matters. One is to give us a chance to contemplate questions that have emerged out of assisted reproductive technologies. The other is to provide us a challenging point to contemplate that convergence of desire and risk and how we can best take forward the technologies we have available to us today as they enter the mainstream of medical treatment. The research group that I co-direct with Professor Vivienne Moore is the Life Course and Intergenerational Health Research Group. We've got a rather broad program of work which commences with our interest in the early origins of health and disease and how we can effectively look at the biological and social pathways that converge at conception and give rise to different health trajectories across the life course. We also have an interest in reproductive careers, about decision-making to do with reproductive choices and fertility choices. And pertinent to tonight's talk is we're also interested in when fertility doesn't work, and we have infertility, involuntary infertility, that then requires a technological intervention. This is, of course, a great opportunity to both assist in people's health, but then also to treat infertility regard infertility and its treatments as, in a sense, a natural experiment from which we can learn much about biological processes and generalise to the wider population. Finally, we also have an interest in the legacies for future generations, potentially how things as commonplace as maternal body composition and pregnancy can impart a lifelong legacy, not just for the child, but for that grandchild as well. Firstly, I'll step through a few definitions simply so that we have a common sense of terminology here. So the WHO now refers to infertility as a disease of the reproductive system defined in terms of a failure to achieve a clinical pregnancy after 12 months or more of regular unprotected intercourse. I've seen similar versions of this running up to 2 years, but this is widely used because approximately 90% of couples who are fertile will conceive within 12 months, and the small remainder that are left over are considered to be infertile. But this does mean that there are a proportion of people who enter infertility treatment who will conceive spontaneously, and we see this routinely as people become pregnant on waiting lists and so on. There's also a demographic definition of infertility, which is somewhat longer. It looks at a 5-year lifespan, which again has some of these common elements of an exposure period and a lack of contraceptive use. Now, of course, fertility is, of course, fundamental to the structure of society, our sense of self, and it underpins all of our concerns with subsequent health, because, of course, there is no health concern if we're not conceived. Now, from a social perspective, one can consider infertility as a disability, which is that there is a failure of some biological system, but it actually becomes a handicap when it starts to impact on social function. So a disability here is that, according, again, a reference from the WHO, it generates a disability and thus access to healthcare if it falls under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So in this regard, we can actually perceive a sense of obligation in treating infertility and regarding it as a welfare matter. In terms of the global distribution of disability then, the WHO estimates there's approximately 34 million women, predominantly in developing countries, who have infertility resulting from 2 primary causes being sepsis and unsafe abortion practices. Now, in terms of perceived childbearing, the numbers are even more startling. And the WHO data suggests that from 2004, there's 186 million ever-married women who have unfulfilled wishes to have children, which effectively translates into 1 in 4 couples. In Australia, how common is this by comparison? Well, the Fertility Society of Australia has estimates that approximately 1 in 6 couples in Australia and New Zealand suffer from infertility, defined by the problem of conceiving within 12 months. And the Australian longitudinal study of women's health, a very large study conducted out of in the eastern seaboard, estimates that 11% of women have had trouble conceiving. Locally, our own work that were published out of the group here from a birth cohort that we constructed of young women who were all between 30 and 32 at the time we interviewed them, found that 24% of them actually had a sense of anxiety and reported difficulty becoming pregnant, and that 26% had actually lost a pregnancy. Of those that had difficulty conceiving, 58% had sought assistance, largely from specialists, but close to a third of those who had a difficulty conceiving resorted primarily to clomiphene citrate, which is an ovulation induction drug. So it's a first-line treatment for an ovulatory infertility. And I'll come back to this later on because I think that unconstrained access to clomiphene citrate is a potential problem that we need to address. Causes of infertility, well, they roughly fall into three camps of female, male, and unknown, and there's broadly a third in each of these. And I shan't dwell on each of these in turn because I want to move on to other matters in the talk. So this is really just a quick list for your perusal. Now, how do we form a response to infertility? Well, there's an acronym ART, and some say it's something of a black art, but the assisted reproductive technology is the application of laboratory and clinical technology to gametes, that is the human egg and sperm, and all the embryos for the purposes of reproduction. So NHMRC has strict guidelines around the use of gametes and restrictions on things such as human cloning. They also have ethical guidelines for how art should be used. And each state, jurisdiction has regulations governing the practice, and there's also a federal body that monitors and records the outcomes of every assisted reproductive technology cycle, which is reported centrally to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in Canberra, but via its external body in New South Wales. Now, the sort of technologies that are routinely used, the first-line treatment is, as I mentioned, ovulation induction. It's a non-invasive process where simply the administration of a drug or drugs can trigger ovulation in women who have ovulation failure. A more invasive procedure involves in vitro fertilisation, in which the gametes are mixed outside of the body, an embryo is formed, and then after some period of maturation or incubation is returned. A more invasive procedure is in intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI, and where a single sperm is surgically injected into an ovum to induce fertilisation. And again, then the fertilised egg is allowed to culture for a period of time and then is returned via a catheter to a woman's uterus. Now, these procedures may operate in conjunction with donor gametes and also and result from donor embryos, but they also may be combined with embryo freezing or gamete freezing. So there's quite an intricate set of steps here and options to enable people to both become pregnant and then, if they have surplus embryos, store them for subsequent use. And then, of course, there is also processes around surrogacy in which a woman's uterus may be used to raise the embryo that's not her own biological child. Now, the current research topics that we have underway or have an interest in regarding ARTS is firstly, the safety and effectiveness of assisted reproductive technology. Secondly, coming from a broader public health perspective, the confluence of lifestyle and demographic factors on fertility, and that includes factors such as age, smoking and obesity, and I'll allude to these very briefly shortly. We also have a long-term interest in the consequences of infertility treatment for patients and offspring. Now, this is both because of our interest in fetal program and the early origins of health and disease. We realise there's a concentration of metabolic disorders in this population, which then have the potential for transgenerational transmission and, unfortunately, the amplification of certain types of chronic disease. So we have, what I believe, a large question in front of us that I'll come back to shortly. And then, of course, we have an interest in birth defects, partly because this is the tip of the iceberg for when developmental stages go seriously awry. And we may well give us insight, by studying these processes, give us insight into basic biological processes that we can then modify elsewhere, but then also because we're interested in the technologies and whether they are in fact contributing to any problem. We're also interested in partitioning patient and treatment effects. Of course, some treatments go very well, and indeed now the majority of people after 1 or 2 cycles of treatment can now go home with a live baby. But it wasn't very long ago that the majority of people left with their wish to take a child home with it being unfulfilled. And then quite often things don't go well during the pregnancy, and of course some of the perinatal outcomes are adverse. So we have an interest in when things don't go well, because they can tell us more about where we should be going in the future. We also have an interest in deferred childbearing, because that's going to influence the structure of society. Excuse me, I'm just getting over this shocking flu that's been going around. Developmental milestones. The first milestone that I could find was Paracelsus. A very interesting chap, sort of the father of toxicology as it turns out, but he believed that you could actually have fertilisation and raise a baby outside of the female body. His strategy, however, was somewhat alchemaic in that it consisted of basically reducing human sperm to black charcoal and then burying it in a dung heap. I'm not sure, there is no record of this process actually resulting in a live birth. In subsequent centuries, we can see that there was a series of observations here leading up to 1959, when there was the first experiments in fertilising rabbits in the USA. That research was stopped on ethical grounds and had to be moved once or twice. But nevertheless, it demonstrated the biological potential for IVF. And then, of course, in 1978, Louise Brown was born, the first IVF baby. Resulting in a Nobel Prize for Edwards, the leader of the group. Now, it's probably not well known that, in fact, the first IVF pregnancy was in Melbourne a couple of years prior to that, but the pregnancy miscarried, so they missed out on a Nobel Prize, unfortunately for them. But nevertheless, in 1980, they caught up and they had the first IVF birth in Australia, and in 1981, the first IVF birth in the USA. And then in 1984, kind of leading the pack, the Melbourne group again had the first pregnancy from a frozen embryo. And then we moved on very quickly through an accelerated rate of innovation here using frozen gametes and different technologies. So we can see there's been a fairly rapid transition here. Sufficiently rapid, in fact, that according to the European Society for Human Reproduction and Technology, there are now over 5 million individuals that have been born from this technology alive on the planet today. It's greater than the population of Denmark. So it's a rather large constituency, and to me as an epidemiologist, this is the concept of having an entire country of people with their own particular circumstance and needs running around the place is really demands serious attention. It also requires our attention, I think, in terms of evaluating the outcomes of treatment. How well have things gone? You know, they've got to be live, but how well are they doing? Now, there's a really interesting dilemma here, because some of these technologies, of course, there was no precedent. They moved straight from rabbits to humans, and there was no precedent. They managed to get a fertilisation to happen, and a baby was born. Well, the risks at the time were entirely theoretical, because nobody had the data. And this is a quote from Carl Wood and Alan Trounston, the guys in Melbourne who really led the way here. And they said that the theoretical risks of pregnancy following IVF and embryo transfer cannot be drawn until a large number of babies are delivered and long-term follow-up is completed. But, you know, initial results from the current small samples are encouraging. And this continues to be a theme that's repeated periodically in the literature. So this is a really very brave step into the unknown at this point. But the question is how, with 5 million people, do we now have enough data to draw some firm conclusions? Now, this is a messy slide, deliberately so, because this is actually an innovation cycle. And rather than use the pointer, I'll actually use the mouse, if I may, because the pointer, the angle is rather acute here. Now, this innovation cycle here, we can imagine that Carl Wood and Alan Troughton were back here as being visionaries during the early experimental development. And then they introduced a technology into clinical care and managed to make it translated into practice. We can then see that ART went through this extraordinary growth period where it's promulgated, wound up, and effectively turned into routine care. And then strikes a period of maturity when people are happy to then start setting up insurance schemes and taxation schemes and health compensation schemes so that it can actually be rolled out as a mainstream practice in medicine. And at that point, you would expect there to be sufficient data to systematically evaluate the outcomes. But assisted reproductive technology is actually in a constant state of innovation. So no sooner do we get IVF up and running than ICSI comes along as another routine practice, or they change the ovulation drugs, or they change culture media. So in fact, there's this constant state of innovation here where the technology is constantly outstripping the available data to evaluate some of the long-term outcomes. Now, of course, the early studies could rely on things such as, do we get a fertilisation rate? That's great. Do we get a pregnancy rate? Great. What's the rate of pregnancy loss? And so they can focus on fine-tuning the technologies using very short-term outcomes. Then they move on to live birth rates and then stillbirth rates and so on. But there's actually very little data that then starts looking at outcomes that are a year, 2 years, 3 years out into the future. Part of this is because also they're working within a clinic and they may have limited contact with the obstetricians delivering the babies, very little contact with the neonatologists, and almost no contact at all with people running monitoring services around things such as birth abnormalities. So what we can see here is, and I'll allude to this in a moment, that there are things that should decline as they're supplanted, as they're replaced by new superior technologies. There are things that should disappear. And unfortunately, we're very bad in medical technology at actually what's called disinvesting, moving away from technologies that are really obsolescent and then focusing on what constitutes best practice. And I've tried, and I've just, at the bottom of this page here, there's flagged a couple of editorials that I've recently written, one for the Medical Journal of Australia and the other for the Archives of Disease and Childhood, in which I try and step through these. And they're available on the web if you have an interest in these. Now, ART is not unique in innovation and adaptation. And you can think of a number of industries, and one of my favourite is the aviation industry. That went through the heroic period where it was jolly to have a shot of schnapps before you jumped in a plane, in a bifold plane, and shot off into the sky. And if you came back, all well and good. And it wasn't a really good day unless you had a good crash landing or something like this to remember it by. But I think it'd be rather poor advertising in a contemporary world if you said, well, you know, started advertising your airline saying, well, look, over 90% of our passengers arrive without death or major disability. I don't think I'll be buying a ticket. Now, the airline industry actually took this on board. And this is actually a figure taken from Aviation Safety Net, and these are a number of fatalities over a time period in here. And in the mid-70s, there was a massive spike. They realised that with the rolling out of aircraft and aviation around the world, that if they didn't do something about safety pretty quickly, there was going to be a jumbo jet crashing every week somewhere in the world. So they quickly got their act together and they sorted out new administrative procedures, new communications procedures, better materials sciences, better computing sciences. And as a consequence, the fatality rate has been falling progressively over the last several decades. Now, this is despite there being an exponential growth in aviation travel. And I think it's just a wonderful lesson for how we can learn from catastrophic errors and try to implement changes. So there's an interesting parallel here because the chances of dying in an air crash are actually extremely slight, but the consequences are clearly catastrophic. So And there's also a certain parallel here in that we're not forced to get in an aeroplane. We do it because we want to do something that's convenient, or we're going somewhere to have a happy experience. But in a similar sense, assisted reproductive technology is here to improve our net sense of happiness. It's not designed to treat disease, it's there to bypass disease and to give us a fulfilling life. And I'm extremely interested in figuring out how safety and innovation can become co-travellers in developing this technology further. So excuse me if you find this is a rather flippant example, but I think that you can pick another one. There was, road traffic accident. I'm sure people now buy cars because of their safety features, a number of airbags in them. But the risk of actually being involved in a serious motor vehicle accident in a lifetime, about 1 in 20, is basically the same risk as having a baby with a birth abnormality. But, we're prepared to buy airbags for the car. How much we are prepared to invest in having a healthy pregnancy? Okay. So historically, I'd suggest, it's a very simple model here. Historically, during an heroic period of developing this technology, there was a major focus on the patient and getting the patient pregnant. Now that we have 5 million people here as the offspring, and we've got a major community of people as well who are investing in the technology, I think we've now got a shared responsibility here, particularly as now 4% of all births in Australia are as a result of assisted reproductive technology. So I think that we've got a different sort of shared burden model. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, one of the major concerns for me is trying to unpack the notion of safety. Unfortunately, life is an intrinsically risky business, and currently death rates are running at 100% over the lifespan. Pregnancy is also extremely risky, and it wasn't that long ago that one of the riskiest things a woman could do was simply become pregnant. And there are still parts of the world where 30% of women might die in childbirth, for example. And in Australia, it's become extremely safe, but there's still a tremendous sense of uncertainty about the outcomes and unpredictability. So against that background risk, it's very easy to discount any additional risk that could be due to additional treatments and so on. And I'll just very quickly allude to 3 outcomes in a couple of slides here: the age, obesity. Well, for example, there can be, excuse me. Okay, sorry. So absolute risk, there are patient factors that contribute to the risk of adverse outcomes. And for example, age, obesity, and the presence of metabolic disorders. Now, this special population is concentrated, or these characteristics are concentrated in the population of people receiving assisted reproductive technologies. So, unfortunately, it's a certainty that the application of ART in this group will carry a disproportionate burden of adverse events in pregnancy, both for the mother and then also for the children. But we allow people to make these decisions for themselves. We see that having children is a fundamental right, and so we make no exclusions around treating people with risky predisposition and metabolic factors that predispose them to adverse outcomes. So we can put that to one side. But a second process that I'd like to have us contemplate for a moment is the notion of our concept of relative safety. And this is where there can be treatment effects that are potentially modifiable to alter the health outcomes both of the mother and the child. So we can quickly step through multiple pregnancies as a iatrogenic multiple pregnancy, and then we'll have a look at some of the treatment modalities, IVF versus ICSI, and cryopreservation and ovarian stimulation protocols. There's a very interesting thing about perception of risk. After the New England Journal of Medicine paper came out, there was a bit of a round in the papers. There was sort of 700. You sort of plot it going around the globe by the hour as people were sort of popping up with comments around the place. And one comment from Australia, and I haven't put the photograph up, but this person had their photograph with their family on the front page of an Australian daily. And the quote was, "The feeling of wanting a child is so huge when you go through IVF, the least of your worries is having a child that may not be perfect." So captured here is the sense of trading off. a benefit against a risk. But it does ask the question, well, who's bearing the risk here? And perhaps it's the child that's disproportionately bearing this risk. And how do we manage that? And what constitutes a reasonable magnitude of risk and what types of risk? And we haven't started having that debate meaningfully in the discipline yet. Now, not all people share the same view. And of course, we're trying to get research funded to look at this question. We're very interested in long-term consequences. And one of our grants that we've had recently reviewed through a major funding body came back with the following assessor's report. I disagree with the applicants that infertility, subfertility is a public health problem. ART is an expensive public health burden that reduces the health and well-being of previously well women and increases the risk of suboptimal pregnancy outcomes in an already overpopulated world. I don't think I'm getting my funding. It's not looking good. Now, and for those of you in the audience who are actually looking for treatment, it goes further. All babies born in Australia should have a right to a healthy start to life, and surely we should be legislating against ART or reproduction in women with reproductive, medical or psychological, including substance abuse problems. So this is it's tough to come back from this and writing a rebuttal. But we did our best. She thought the team were okay, but she wasn't prepared to think that we should just shut up shop, basically. Even though there's 5 million people out there, the horse has bolted, and we should just ignore the whole question together. But I respectfully disagree. So quickly, a little bit about lifestyle factors in fertility and a couple of the big ones that impact on this, and I'll mention just the first three. Because the fourth one is so vast. Diet is, we understand this is absolutely universal for reproductive functioning, and we should think no further than folic acid supplementation and neural tube defects and realise that they can play a critical role. But the first three we've actually got some reliable data for some of the outcomes that we've got of interest. And age is a very interesting one because we're seeing a very interesting phenomenon here. This is the life expectancy of birth plotted from the ABS. It's an old slide, and they have updated, and now you'll be pleased to know that you're going to live another 10 years past where we're 2001. It's one of those strange paradoxes, like Zeno's paradox, where all you need is to hope that the average life expectancy exceeds the rate of your own ageing, and you live forever. Now, against this, fertility rates in Australia have actually declined, and as a consequence, what we're seeing is this extraordinary compression of reproductive careers. So historically, couples, I say couples, but primarily women would be engaged in the process of pregnancy and childbearing for 10 or 20 years, but now it's been compressed into a sort of a 5-year window in one's mid to late 30s. Against a lifespan of 80-odd years. So we're in fact spending a very small percentage of our time in childbearing. So the nature of society is actually changing around these things. Now, unfortunately, what's happening is that, this is comparing again, it's a slightly older, but the contemporary slide only varies by a couple of percentage points. What's happened is that basically in the Australian population, it's the young people who have fallen off in their reproductive careers. And in fact, what we can see here is this growth in older women seeking assisted reproductive technology. Now, people think that this is a recent phenomenon, but it is not, because in these older age groups, we're yet to get back to the fertility rates that we saw prior to World War II. It was really not uncommon for women to be having children well into their 40s, but that was partly prior to the epochal change of having reliable contraception. So the older mother is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's a well-established phenomenon. What is the new phenomenon is there being an absence of younger mothers. Okay, so it's quite a different story. So does age really matter? We can all think of stories about, the older mother, the surprise pregnancy, the British Prime Minister's wife becoming pregnant at the age of 40, well, I can't quite remember how old she was. And some classic examples, there's quite a few in the literature. Elizabeth Greenall, 39 children with a husband, gave birth to her last child at the age of 54. What a surprise. And the Lancet recording the story of a woman at the age of 62 giving birth to triplets, her 11th, 12th, 13th child. Well, and so does age really matter? Well, unfortunately, it does. Here's a slide, and this indicating a new concept, which is not fertility, fertility being the effective performance of having a child, but this is actually fecundability, which is the biological potential to have a child. Okay, so it's a slightly different concept. And if one thinks that you've got 100% of that potential at the age of 20, there's some slippage, so there's 80% of that potential by age 30, and then it just plummets in basically a linear fashion to the mid-40s. So sort of roughly a 10 percentage fall per annum. Now, this is a rather odd way it's an odd data set for getting this, because one has to have a non-contracepting population in which they're actually desiring to have children. So they're having to go back and reanalyse 17th century data from the Hutterites and various other communities in order to get this, because unfortunately we can't do a randomised trial on this one. Look, you're on the no contraception group and you're on the contraception group. Now just, daily monitoring of intercourse, and we'll see what happens. So we can't do that. We have to do observational studies for this sort of stuff in epidemiology. But there is biological plausibility to this, because we can then look inside the ovary and start counting primordial follicles and find that it follows this similar curve, and there seems to be this sort of switchover point at around the age of 35. And we don't know what triggers this, but there's some sort of mechanism there that accelerates that decline in follicle count, and that correlates with fertility rates. Now, and it also actually reflected in, even if we overcome the problems of ovulation and so on, you get people to actually stimulate enough ovaries and enough eggs out and create an embryo, then we actually find that the take-home baby rate actually follows the same curve again after IVF treatment. So these are data from collected from around Australia and reported through the ANZARD report of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So you can actually see, for example, here it's rather salutary reading, that 5% mark here. So if I'm afraid if you're over 40 years of age, the prospects of taking home a baby from a single cycle is extremely low. And it does beg the question as to whether this is reasonable. But again, in Australia, we've had that debate and decided that it is reasonable. Now, this explains some of that variation. And it's a slightly complex slide. So I'll just take you through one of these here. Now, if you sort of think about that curve on its side, now here's the 50% line here. So 50% of women are actually going to start having some evidence of subfertility by the age of 31. And then that rises to 100% by the age of 41, so they'll be subfertile. And then we can move on to having the commencement of sterility. 50% of women will be effectively sterile by the age of 41, and ovulatory, and then menopause. The average age of menopause is 51. But interestingly, a menopause and sterility can actually run right back here into early 30s, and some 5% of women at the age of 35 or so will effectively be sterile. And I tried to assist a reproductive clinic and trying to estimate some of this so I could figure out a cutoff for a funding scheme. Okay. Now, just to reiterate this, here on the left again, this is for the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and these are using one's own eggs in a fresh cycle by age, and we can again see that 6% live deliveries per cycle in women over 40. Now, another really important point to indicate here is that we can actually divide clinics into effectively like a kind of a league table of success rates. And I'm afraid down here at the fourth quartile of the league table, the overall success rates are actually pretty poor. So I think this indicates, to me at least, that there's an opportunity, at least in Australia, for lifting the game and creating better standards for routine practice in this area, so that we get better overall success rates and greater consistency amongst the people treated. So why do people actually delay then, if age is so important? Well, we actually had a PhD student on this matter. Emily Steele's PhD's gone through. We're trying to get the papers out at the moment on this. And what we found that we could model economic insecurity. It's an entirely rational decision It's a rational process to an irrational circumstance. Effectively, what a couple in their early or mid-20s could rationally hope to create a stable home in a capital city in Australia in the current economic circumstance. So we've gone through this dreadful circumstance. Now we're liberated from forced conception because we've now got reliable contraception. So what happens is that the economic space gets filled then with casualisation and part-time jobs and greater aspirations. So we end up with this dreadful crush. So we're able to find that, in fact, job insecurity, both the self and partner, housing costs, and career and personal aspirations really pushed this decision to have a child out quite late. And indeed, there's a disproportionate influence for well-educated women, where a single year of uncertain, precarious employment reduced the risk of childbearing by 14% per annum. So it's really a very marked effect. Moving on to smoking, just momentarily here. Smoking, we all understand, is bad. It's also associated with a longer time to pregnancy in the general population. Now, this is a forest plot. For those of you who don't see it here, haven't seen one of these before, there's an odds ratio, which is basically a risk down the middle here, and if you fall to the right of that line, there's an increase in the risk, and if you fall to the left, there's a decrease in the risk. And we can sum these using a mathematical process, and basically it comes out that there's an odds ratio or a probability of 1.6 for infertility if you smoke. And this tallies very nicely with the observational literature, but then also through IVF, we can also demonstrate that if a woman smokes, you can see her getting pregnant, but it doubles the risk of early pregnancy loss, which is a rather savage consequence. Body mass, this is from the Nurses' Health Study. It's an observational cohort study in the US, and we can see that the relative risk in this case of infertility rises exponentially with a BMI above 24. And again, even if we get somebody pregnant, then we can see over here in the odds compared to women of normal body weight, there's a 50% chance of pregnancy amongst those who are very obese. And then we aren't showing the data here, but there's also an increased risk of pregnancy loss and basically doubling the risk of stillbirth as well. So I'm afraid obesity is a major, not just a challenge to fertility, it's also a major obstetric and perinatal challenge as well. So with regard to treatment effects from assisted reproductive technologies, a major question first question that was interest to me, coming into the area is multiple pregnancy. My background originally was in public health, and when I came into this area some 12 years ago, I thought, why are all these multiple pregnancies occurring in assisted reproductive technology? We have to get over this. And then I was also interested in, well, how well are IVF babies? So anyway, the ART was undergoing rapid period of development, and despite the early advances, it was still very resource intensive. It had low chances of pregnancy per cycle of treatment. And so it was actually Alan Trounson had the bright idea of adapting an idea from animal production, where he came from New Zealand, where he's breeding cows, where they use multiple embryo transfer over there. He thought, I know, we'll do this in humans too, without much of a thought about the public health consequences and the obstetric consequences of multiple pregnancy. So the risks of multiple pregnancy in humans is that the course of pregnancy is really seriously compromised, increased risk of preeclampsia and hypertension, maternal death, miscarriage, prematurity, caesarean delivery, low birth weight, discordant birth weight in the twins, perinatal mortality is 2.5 times higher. Amongst those who survive, there's increased respiratory distress, greater admission to neonatal intensive care, need for ventilation, ventilated bed days are up, cerebral palsy's doubled. It's up to tenfold, depending on the process involved here. And then it's not all happy sailing thereafter, where there can also be some difficulty in socialising, developmental delays, language acquisition, and so on. Okay, so in Australia, this is recognised as something of a problem. Indeed, John Kerrin here from Adelaide wrote a letter in the Lancet in '83 suggesting that there was a need for single embryo transfer. This is back when there was a multiple pregnancy rate of over 35% in Australia. And so they pulled back the number of embryos from 3 to 2, and then got the feasibility of embryo freezing up so that you could actually have a transfer and then returns the spare ones. Now, but what was happening was that even though single embryo transfer was increasing, the twinning rate was actually accelerating because the embryologists were actually improving their technology and was outstripping the process of putting back fewer and fewer embryos. So we recognised this as a problem, and colleagues Rob Norman and Jim Wang and I put together a randomised controlled trial on this to put back one embryo. And it was a multi-site trial, international collaborators in Singapore and New Zealand and so on. But the trial failed because the mere process of rewriting the patient information sheet doubled the rate of elective single embryo transfer and ran the trial enrolment phase out so long we couldn't enrol people and we couldn't get renewed funding. But as a consequence, the good news is that single embryo transfer was over the hump and started skyrocketing, and the twinning rate started dropping. Now, we've since been able to continue these out, and the multiple pregnancy rate is now down to 6% Australia-wide, which I think is great. And single embryo transfer is now accounting for 70% of all cycles. So we've turned the corner in that regard, which is great. And this compares with 35%, over 30% still in the USA, and over 20% in the UK. So we're really doing a great job in that score. We did eventually get our data published in an international meta-analysis, but unfortunately, we're not the first author. We're buried in there somewhere. Health outcomes of further interest. Very quickly, we still have the rhetoric that most children are healthy, but I'm actually interested in the ones that aren't, because I want to actually lift them up. Now, just one slide on this to indicate the perinatal mortality. These are odds ratios again for pooled studies. Perinatal mortality 1.7, preterm birth is double, very preterm birth is tripled, low birth weight 1.7, small for gestational age has increased, caesarean sections increased, neonatal intensive care has increased. So it's not all entirely optimistic in my view, and there's much need for revision of practice. A big question that I'll move on to now just for 7 minutes, and I'll leave a little bit of time for questions. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit slower though, is to do with congenital malformations. Now, there's been some interest in this area and some theoretical interest from a range of areas. And I'll skip over that, and I'll come to this. There's an interesting study that came out of the US that was able to pull apart some of the specific types of defect, and they were able to purport that there were certain biological pathways here that made sense. And the types of things that consistently came up were cardiac defects and musculoskeletal defects and urogenital defects, and they seem to fall into two camps of possible pathways. One's to do with some of the estrogen disrupting drugs that are administered during the treatment, and the others are to do with some of the the embryo culture medias and the incubation processes to do with oxygen. And this slide is here to indicate to us that, in fact, time to pregnancy is also a risk factor for birth defects. So there could be both patient and treatment effects here. So we had some residual questions that interested us. Is there a risk? Do twins carry the same risk as singletons? Do all processes, all ART exposures carry the same risk? Is it treatment or patient effect? And can we do anything about it? So we put together a large study here, and even though I needed to concede that the majority of births resulting from assisted conception were free of birth defects, our knowledge is limited to common immediate outcomes where there's no lag, and effectively for old technologies. We don't have the data on the new technologies yet. So what we're able to do was that we put together a data set here in South Australia which consisted of all births in South Australia between January 86 and December 2002. We linked that to all terminations, all birth defects in the registry, the cerebral palsy registry, and all cycles of assisted reproduction technology in South Australia. So we put together a data set that was a de-identified data set of 302,800 births. And then we're able to verify that the birth defect rate was 5.8% of the general population. Then we moved on to looking at assisted conception. And we looked at all forms of assisted conception, all of the available technologies, but we also uniquely were able to identify a subset of women who had both an ART baby and a baby from a spontaneous pregnancy. So we were able to do a sibling comparison within mother. We included a range of potential confounding factors because, of course, people going through ART have very different medical histories and predilections. So we're able to look at occupation, for example, and pre-existing medical conditions. Here is an inclusion list of what we did look at. This is just an example. I'd suggest that if you want to look at the full listing, then please they're listed here, but this is just to indicate that they're not trivial defects. They're cardiovascular defects, urogenital defects. These are things that require surgery and that have life-changing consequences. We also excluded a lot of things that were trivial, and again, they're listed in detail at the website. So we calculated some odds ratios. We didn't adjust for multiple pregnancy because that was in the causal pathway potentially. We didn't adjust for multiple testing either because it's an observational study, and we did a limited number of analyses. But we did adjust for clustering of babies within mother because it may be sort of a mother effect, and mothers may be contributing, and often do, more than one birth defect to the cohort. Okay, quick scan of some of the results here that are of key interest to us. Yes, the mothers who went through, assisted conception were older, they're richer, they're whiter, they're more professional, less likely to smoke, but for all this, they're also more likely to have diseases in pregnancy, including any history of diabetes. They're more likely to have hypertension and pregnancy-induced hypertension, more likely to have anemia. So they're more socially advantaged, but unhealthier. What we were able to show initially was that we replicated a systematic review that had been conducted by colleagues in Perth, showing that there was basically an odds ratio 1.28 for any defect and 1.33 for multiple defects. So that's right on the sort of the money for national and international comparisons that are of high quality. And we've got robust numbers here to demonstrate this. Now, what's also interesting is the unadjusted odds ratio means that that's the one that doesn't take into account maternal factors as well. So basically, in this population as a whole, 47% increased risk of major birth defects. If we take away the maternal factors, that drops to a 28% increased risk of major birth defects. So these are not, in my view, trivial increases in risk at a population level when you're considering 5 million individuals in the population. And also, intriguingly, greater than doubling the risk of cerebral palsy as well. But I think that could be a different etiology. I may have time to allude to that, perhaps in a question. The singletons, the effects are pretty much the same, slightly larger, because most of the defects are in fact occurring in the singletons. The IVF twins and the spontaneously conceived twins actually look remarkably similar in their birth defects profile. Funnily enough, the ART twins should actually be healthier, if anything, because they're almost entirely dizygotic. They're fraternal twins, and it's actually the MZ twins and monozygotic twins where they're sharing blood supplies and tissues that tend to have the riskier pregnancies. Okay, we then went on to look at the specific treatment modalities. In IVF, there's a 20% odds ratio 1.26 in the unadjusted, which then dropped dramatically after we adjusted for patient factors and became non-significant. And then if we actually put those embryos through a freeze-thaw cycle, then there's almost no effect whatsoever. An odds ratio of 1.02, there's only a 2% increased risk. So really, this is pretty interesting, and only a 17% there, even in the unadjusted. So, one take-home message is that frozen embryo transfer from IVF is actually pretty safe with regard to the risk of birth defects. And indeed, this has precipitated some groups in Australia moving straight to vitrification, where they're freezing all embryos and avoiding fresh cycles altogether, because they think that there's a problem with returning embryos back into the hyperstimulated maternal environment. ICSI, by contrast, the associations, the odds ratios were higher, they're more resistant to adjustment, and the freezing did reduce it to a non-significant level, but I think we're simply running out of power here as to why this wasn't significant. And again, what we also found here was the spontaneous conception group. There were also at increased risk, so there's something about being infertile per se. And then finally, we also found, because this is effectively the sibling analysis here. Okay. And the reason why I wanted to, this is simply to indicate that the singletons is where some of this is happening, and that in the singletons, the freeze-thaw cycle actually reduces ICSI down substantially. Right. The one final outcome of interest here are the perinatal outcomes for this group. What we can see is there's actually an increased risk, and basically a doubling in the risk of stillbirths in the assisted conception group. The birth weights of even the singletons are down 150 grams or so, and that's a major predictor of well-being postnatally. And there's basically a doubling in prematurity of birth, consistent with international literature. And I'll skip over that one. There were no, in contrast to other people's work, there was no evidence of excess syndromes in here. Other people have found there's imprinting defects, Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome and so on. We didn't find any evidence of this in here. So this work extended previous work of others by having a census of all treatment and outcomes in a defined jurisdiction. Adelaide's a wonderful place for being able to do this. Linked over an extended period of time, we could see that there were elevated risks, but adjusting for confounders reduced this. There was differences between IVF and ICSI, and adjustment to ICSI had a little effect. And there appears to be both patient and treatment effects here. The clomiphene citrate, where we noticed a tripling the risk of birth defects after poorly administered, poorly supervised clomiphene citrate, requires further investigation. What do we want to do next? Well, we actually want to do more of the same. We want to link more data. We're actually interested in the long-term consequences for these children in terms of more subtle effects, because there's new literature emerging that there are other impairments to do with metabolic well-being. We also want to link to the cancer registries, because there appears to be an increased risk of cancer both for children and for the mothers. And what I should do is finish with a quote from a fellow from Adelaide, Damien Adams, who regards himself as the product of a rather grand natural experiment, possibly one of the grandest natural experiments of the 20th century. And he's got a background in fetal physiology and understands what experimentation looks like. And he declared that as a product of reproductive technologies, I feel very much like an experiment in medical and social science. And as a scientist, I think I have a pretty good idea what an experiment is, and I see it every day when I look in the mirror. So we have we've developed a remarkable technology. It's now mainstream medicine, and I think we've got a very large group of people to look after as a consequence. And I very much look forward to my funding support next year, if not this year. So thank you very much for your interest, and I'd be more than happy to consider questions and comments. Thank you.